Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the final in our webinar series for the Western Governors Drought Forum. Today's webinar is titled One Size Doesn't Fit All, Why Variation in Hydrology and Legal Structures Means That Drought Looks Different Across the West. I'm Carly Brown, Water Policy Advisor at the Western Governors Association. Again, as I said earlier, if you're in need of technical assistance, please message Amy Schweig through the WebEx application, or you can call WGA at 303-623-9378. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to describe the Western Governors Drought Forum initiative and go over a few logistics for today's webinar. First of all, the Western Governors Drought Forum is the chairman's initiative of Governor Brian Sandoval, chairman of the Western Governors Association and governor of Nevada. The framework, what Governor Sandoval envisioned whenever he created the Western Governors Drought Forum was a framework for sharing best practices on drought management and response. As a portion of that framework for sharing best practices, we first held a workshop series, 5 workshops held all across the West to look at the ways that drought impacts different industries and the way that those industries respond. From that workshop series, we identified common themes to dive into through these webinars in this webinar series. We've already held 4 webinars, and you can watch all of those online through our YouTube page, which you can access by going to our webpage, westgov.org. Now I'll get into the logistics for today's webinar. We are very grateful to be joined by Jason King, the state engineer of the state of Nevada, who is the moderator today. Jason has been an active participant in the Drought Forum up to this point, and so he's really the perfect person to moderate today's discussion. Jason will briefly introduce the panelists and then ask each panelist to deliver brief opening remarks. Then Jason will moderate a discussion of the panelists and also offer his own insights. If you would like to ask questions for the panelists for that discussion, please send those to me directly, Carly Brown, through the chat box in the bottom right of your screen, and I will pass those along to Jason. All general attendees are on mute, so we'll just take the questions by text rather than having you ask them yourself. A recording of today's webinar will be available by Friday, and I will send that email out to you to let you know that you can watch this webinar and distribute that to your colleagues. With all of that being said, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jason King.
Thank you, Carly. Good morning, or perhaps even good afternoon to some of you participating in this final webinar. It's my pleasure to act as moderator for this session. We are honored to have 3 distinguished panelists with us today. Frank Belock, he's Deputy General Manager of the San Diego County Water Authority. Jack Berger, Vice President of the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts and owner of Berger Ranches. And Sharon Megdal, Director of the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona. Before having each of our 3 panelists provide brief opening remarks, I just wanted to give you a quick look at the diversity of drought here in Nevada. 7 out of 10 Nevadans live in the greater Las Vegas metropolitan area in southern Nevada. 90% of their water supply comes from the Colorado River and 10% from groundwater supplies. The drought in that area of our state is tied inextricably to what's going on along the Colorado River through all the upper and lower basin states. In Nevada, those Colorado River issues are managed by our Colorado River Commission and the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Once water is taken out of Lake Mead and served to its largely urban customers, the management of those resources is done at the local purveyor level where water conservations are implemented. Such efforts include lawn buyout programs, desert landscaping requirements, low-flow fixtures, pool cover rebates, and irrigation clock rebates, just to name a few. And I would like to say that much of those efforts have been ongoing since the drought on the Colorado began in the early 2000s. Now, contrast the hydrology of the Colorado River system to what our farmers are facing in rural Nevada and what they're having to deal with during this prolonged drought. In our rural areas, 4 years of drought has significantly depleted the soil moisture on their fields, as you can imagine. Where in the past a good winter would wet up their lands and provide a good head start to the irrigation season, they don't have that luxury right now. Drilling down even a little more, the use of groundwater in our state has historically been thought of as being drought resistant. Since there are large amounts of groundwater in storage in the aquifers, as long as the drought isn't too persistent, those aquifers can recover over time. However, even in this drought, we are seeing unprecedented water level declines in some of our basins, and as a result, our office has issued a curtailment order of 50% of supplemental groundwater pumping in 2 of them. And just as a side, we just issued that order about 2 months ago, and that order has been stayed by the courts as of about 2 weeks ago. Moving on, unlike drought-resistant groundwater supplies, if you will, our surface water supplies, and I'm not really talking about the Colorado River here, are regulated based on the prior appropriation doctrine. And of course, during these times of drought, junior water appropriators are frequently cut off from their delivery. Just to give you a little flavor of what we're dealing with here, on one of the river systems near where I'm at here in Carson City, Nevada, they're receiving 3% delivery of their water on the river. Another river is seeing about a 20% delivery. So, and I know I'm preaching to the choir out there, but things are really looking bleak. And unlike California, where massive amounts of water are stored in reservoirs and connected via aqueducts from the northern part of the state to the southern part, Nevada, being the driest state in the nation, doesn't have the luxury of managing such large reservoirs in order to move water from one place to another. So our policies and water laws associated with water management in rural areas relying on snowpack and rain in the Great Basin areas of the state are drastically different than those related to the urban uses and coinciding Colorado River compact in southern Nevada. So today our office is dealing with temporary transfers of both surface and groundwater statewide to take water from where it isn't being used to where it is being used, while users of the Colorado River are working amongst all the basin states to manage that system. So with that short introduction, I'd like to move on into the schedule, and I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Frank Belock. Frank is the Deputy General Manager of the San Diego County Water Authority, and I'm just going to turn it over to you, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Jason. My PowerPoint has come up on the screen, so I'll be using that as a guide to my remarks. Go to the first slide. So our big part of our response is seawater desalination. We're obviously in San Diego County, we're a coastal county or agency. And so we have a project going on right now in North San Diego County in the city of Carlsbad. You can see the photograph there. It's right near the Encina power plant where we're using an existing intake. So actually the seawater comes through the lagoon that you see, and the treatment plant area is circled in red. It'll be the largest seawater desal project in the Western Hemisphere. We're about 80% done now, and we expect to be completed the fall of this year. Go ahead, next slide. The driver for this project is our diversification strategy. Back in 1991 is when we had our last big drought. At that point in time, we were very reliant on the Metropolitan Water District as our sole source of water, and they would get their water from the Colorado River or the northern Sierras. So back then, we developed our 2020 plan, which you see on the pie chart on the right. The pie chart in the middle shows you how we're progressing up until last year. And you can see on that right pie chart in the orangish color is the seawater desalination project. So you can see how we've incorporated that into our diversification strategy. Next slide. So seawater desalination is sustainable. It's a new local water supply, which gives us control, which we obviously like, reduces the need for imported water. It's drought-proof, obviously. It's a big ocean out there. The water quality is actually improved over what we typically get. Right now it's more expensive than existing imported supplies. That we expect that to change probably in the early 2020s. But it's on par with new local supplies such as potable reuse and other local sources such as that. Next slide. So we entered into our water purchase agreement with Poseidon Resources who have been developing the project. Our board approved the WPA around Thanksgiving of 2012, and it outlines the commercial and financial terms for both the production and the delivery of water to us, and then we bring it into our existing system. Part of the agreement transfers the risk, a lot of the risk over to Poseidon, the private developer, They had to obtain all the permits. They have all the design reliability, all the cost overruns. They will operate the facility. And if the water does not meet the water quality requirements prescribed in the water purchase agreement, we can redirect that water. Next slide. The responsibilities prescribed in the WPA, Poseidon, they have to permit, design, and build a plant, as well as a 10-mile pipeline that will carry the plant to our existing conveyance system. They're doing that, the pipeline, through a design-build agreement. They will own and operate and maintain the plant, and we do have rights to purchase it in the future. They'll supply the product water that needs to meet those water quality requirements that I mentioned that are prescribed in the WPA. We have to make modifications to our system. That was one of our requirements, and we've actually accomplished that right now. We will own and operate the 10-mile conveyance pipeline that I mentioned. We'll take that into our custody and own and operate it. And then we entered into a take-or-pay agreement with Poseidon where we will accept or we'll pay for 48,000 acre-feet a year. The plant itself can produce about 56,000 acre-feet, so we can purchase that at our option, but we've guaranteed them that we'll purchase 48,000 acre-feet. Next slide. The estimated cost is just over $1 billion. It'll probably finish a little bit under that. You can see on the slide how that breaks out. A little over half of it is the plant itself. About a quarter of it was the financing costs, and then you see everything else. The O&M costs will be $49 to $54 million. That's for both the plant and the pipeline, so we'll be splitting that because we have the pipeline, and they will maintain and operate the plant. The unit cost, if we purchase all 56,000 acre-feet, it'll be just over $2 an acre-foot. If we limit ourselves to just the take-or-pay amount that we've guaranteed, it'll be $2,257 an acre-feet. Next slide. This is just a schematic of the plant itself. It's just very briefly, it's conventional pre-treatment, but then it has the reverse osmosis membranes that are really the big engine that does most of the work. Next slide. The progress, again, we're 80% complete. Pretty much the construction-intensive activities are winding down. Right now we're ramping up on the commissioning of the facility, and again, we expect to be online this fall. And next slides. I have a bunch of photos. Here's where we were in September of 2013, and then in January 2015. The upper right, you can see the flocculation basins, and what you see on the left side is the reverse osmosis facility. Next slide. This is the product water tank. There's 3 surge tanks that you see, 8 2,000 horsepower pumps that'll be pushing the water towards our conveyance system. The white tanks you see are CO2 tanks, and these all sit on the product water tank, which is 2.5 million gallons in size. Next slide. The commissioning is where we're just starting right now. It's prescribed in the WPA. They have to do a full system test. Once we certify they have done that, then there's a 30-day performance test where they can show they can sustain producing the water at 50 million gallons a day. If they miss a day for some reason, there are certain events where they would have to go back and start the 30 days over again. Then we have a surge test where we turn off all the pumps and then make sure those surge tanks can handle the pressure coming back to the facility. And then we have a commercial operation period of 120 days, at which point we start buying water. And then the Poseidon has 4 months to finish the project, which is landscaping and other things that don't go into water production. And then we will be at project completion. Next slide. And that's me.
Thank you, Frank, very much for that presentation and opening remarks. We're going to move into our next panelist, and Mr. Jack Berger, Vice President of the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts and owner of Berger Ranches. And Jack, it's all yours.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Western Governors Association for the opportunity to speak about irrigation in our part of the world. I realize we're on a different river system than a lot of you are on the North Platte, and I think a lot of people on this call are probably on the Colorado, but they all function the same. Next slide. My great-grandpa came to the upper North Platte Valley near Saratoga in 1909, and I presently live on the same place. That's where I live in the foreground, and you can see you know, towards the mountains there, how the water spreads out just on gravity flow ditches and stuff, and see the meadows and quite a change in production, whether there's irrigation or not in this country. The lower end of our ranch is about 7,000 feet, and then we go on up from there. I don't think I need to explain to this group that once water is used or diverted, whether it be for irrigation or drinking water for livestock or domestic use, it is not gone forever. I know there are people who believe that, and our irrigation water is used over and over many times before it leaves our state and then is used again and again down the river system. Where I live at the headwaters of the Platte River, we have no storage. There are several reservoirs below us on the North Platte, but we don't have anything here. So this time of the year, what we see in the mountains is what we get when Mother Nature decides to send it. And we don't have the luxury of storage or the ability to call the water as we need it. Next slide. Usually sometime in May, the weather warms and the snow melt starts, and it is up to us to grab the water as it is available. What we do at that time is what raises our hay and pasture and makes the whole system work for the water users downstream as well as for the fisheries and the recreationists. This whole system on a watershed-wide basis was founded on flood irrigation. Take the water when it is available in the spring and run it across the land while the snow melt is happening. Oftentimes at the height of runoff, there's a double appropriation available. To some, that may seem like a lot of water to be diverting, but the reality is that even though there's a double at the headgate, a good portion of that is lost before it is spread on the land. We have very few line ditches or pipelines. Many of these ditches parallel the creek for hundreds of yards before leaving the creek on grade, all the while losing water back to the creek in the process. Some of the water is back to the creek in a matter of hours. Other water is in bank storage, returning to the stream in days, weeks, or even months. Some of the water that is lost creates wetlands, which are a nice benefit to wildlife, but wetlands are a major contributor to aquifer recharge. The whole process of flood irrigation, besides growing hay, is to soak up the sponge, which is our bank storage. Dr. Quentin Skinner said that it's the inefficiencies of flood irrigation that make the whole system work. Next slide. Anytime that I hear or read about water efficiency and using less water, you know, if it's municipal or domestic use, like watering your lawn or taking a shorter shower, you know, I see that as a direct savings. When it's ag-related, I think the whole water cycle needs to be considered, meaning if we're going to use less water, how is that going to affect the aquifer or the stream recharge? There's a situation near where I live where they installed several pivot sprinklers. However, they had no storage, and they relied on direct flow to supply their water. The stream that supplies water can go nearly dry in the late season, and they learned very quickly that the flood irrigation that occurred higher in that drainage was critical to the late season flows they needed to supply water for their sprinklers. It was the bank storage from the flood irrigation that provided the water that they needed. This is how they did their drought management in their own small way. They had no storage, so this was their next best scenario. There are many situations like this of taking a previously ephemeral stream that only flowed in the spring or from rain events, and flood irrigation makes them a perennial stream that flows year-round. Next slide. Streams are vital for recharging the nation's groundwater supply. Water enters the groundwater through the stream bed, so obviously a perennial stream will contribute more to the groundwater supply than an ephemeral stream. Another added benefit of flood irrigation is improved water quality. If you spread the spring runoff that is loaded with sediment and allow it to filter back to the stream, it greatly improves water quality. Next slide. I have searched and searched for pictures of the North Platte River back when there was little, if any, irrigation in this valley. And at that time, I think there was very few pictures taken, and nobody felt the need to take a picture of a dry river, so I've never been able to find one. But, you know, at that time, there was very little water diverted in the spring. The snow melt started, and it was like flushing a toilet. You know, there was a huge flow, and then it was gone. The old-timers said the North Platte used to go nearly dry in August and September, and they said you could step across it on the rocks and not get your shoes wet. I think these pictures show what the North Platte looks like in the fall as a result of flood irrigation and bank storage. Next slide. And I'm not saying that flood irrigation is the right thing for everyone on down the river, but these are some of the benefits of flood irrigation to the river system. And I had one quote from when I was in Sacramento at the Drought Forum last fall, and I can't remember who said it, but I had it written in my notes, and it says a healthy economy needs a healthy functioning ecosystem, and I believe that's what we have here. So I look forward to any questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Appreciate the presentation. We're now going to move right into our third and final panelist, and that's Sharon Megdal, who's Director of the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona. Sharon, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and it's my great pleasure to participate in this panel. And I'm going to talk a bit about drought and water management here in Arizona. And if you go to the next slide, I think Arizona itself is an example of a region where one size does not fit all, and there's great variety across the state in our water management and our water and drought situations. For these few minutes, though, I'm going to talk primarily about issues related to our use of Colorado River water and how that relates to our management of groundwater. If you take a look at that map, you see some areas that are shaded in a kind of teal turquoise color. Those are our active management areas where groundwater has been managed since 1980. The red line that's actually going uphill, even though it's going south, is the Central Arizona Project Aqueduct, which brings Colorado River water into Central Arizona. And when it comes to drought and long-term drought, the Central Arizona Project customers are quite vulnerable to shortage because CAP has very low priority among the Colorado River water users in times of drought or shortage declaration. And Arizona has planned for drought, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's done in terms of storage for the future. Next slide, please. So here's another map that just shows some of the different regions more from a hydrogeological point of view. And you see kind of from the middle of the state south is the basin and range lowlands. And this area has deep alluvial basins where there's limited natural recharge, but there's a very large amount of water in storage, and these deep aquifers are very good for what we call artificial recharge or deliberate recharge into the aquifers for storage. I just want to note that lower left graphic is something I use a lot in presentations because I like that it shows that aquifers are not just pristine lakes underground, but water interspersed with materials. And in Arizona, overall, we rely on groundwater for about meeting 40% of our water supplies. If you go to the next slide, please. I mentioned that we have employed artificial recharge or deliberate recharge where we're most often through spreading basins, but not exclusively, allowing water to infiltrate into some of these deep aquifers. So that photo there is a recharge basin that my class just visited less than 2 weeks ago, where they turned on the water for us. And so you can see that is Colorado River water delivered through the Central Arizona Project to the Tucson region, and it's being delivered to a storage basin where it's stored underground. It's both recovered for current use as well as water stored for the future. And what's very important for Arizona, and I think for people thinking about using aquifer storage or water banking, is that Arizona has a very extensive regulatory framework for the permitting of the facilities, the storage, and the recovery of water, and that's all very important. That lower right picture I just put in there just as a reminder for me to mention that the water is, as I mentioned, the Central Arizona Project water pumped uphill, and this is the forebay of a pumping station right near Tucson. Next slide. So in 1996, and this year is important because you hear a lot about the 15-year drought that we're experiencing on the Colorado River system. So that started at about 1999. In 1996, Arizona authorized the Water Banking Authority to store water for times of future shortage. And the Water Banking Authority, which is a state agency, has stored millions of acre feet for the future and has also stored water on behalf of Nevada and also some on behalf of California. And this map, which is from, shows groundwater storage trends from a recent article through 2002. What's notable about that is that you might think Arizona, with its reliance on groundwater, its high aridity and rapid growth, might look more like Texas or California, which might look redder now than it did a couple of years ago. But it's because we have been able to substitute surface water for groundwater and store water for the future that the colors are not in the red category or orange. Now, that could change in the future if a shortage were declared on the Colorado River. And this brings me to my last slide here, and that is, if we do have a Colorado River shortage declared by the Secretary of Interior, that has differential impacts across the entire Colorado River Basin and particularly within Arizona itself. And so in central Arizona, where we have a lot of agriculture, this happens to be a photo showing a drip irrigated field, I think, of melons, deliveries of surface water could be curtailed at the time of a shortage declaration. And on my right, I show Yuma area, which is a highly productive and rich area for vegetable production. They have more senior water rights. So in Arizona, if there's a shortage declared on the Colorado River, we have irrigated agriculture in central Arizona that will be facing questions such as, do we pump more groundwater to replace the surface water? Do we change cropping patterns? Do we change irrigation technology? Do we fallow fields, or some combination of them all? So we have some real drought impacts being felt now and in the near future, of course, dependent on whether a shortage is declared and whether Mother Nature gives us some precipitation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for the presentation and the opening remarks. As mentioned in the beginning by Carly, we're now going to move into a moderated Q&A with the panelists before moving into an open Q&A. And my first question that I have is for Frank. Were there any major regulatory roadblocks that you had to overcome to get the project to its current state? And also, second part of that question is there value in exploring a regulatory framework that expedites the permitting process for desal projects during drought disaster declarations?
Okay. I mean, I wouldn't call them regulatory roadblocks. We needed to get a lot of permits for the project. It being on the coastal area, there's a coastal commission. There's multiple agencies that govern from a regulatory standpoint projects like this. We were able to get there. It took a lot of work, and there's certainly money that had to be put into addressing some of the concerns they had. In terms of water treatment, we have the Department of Drinking Water, who eventually has to certify the site and certify that it's ready to start producing water and putting it into our system. They've been very cooperative in terms of working with us throughout the course of the project, so that when we're ready, when commissioning is completed, that they're knowledgeable about the project and comfortable with it. But be that as it is, they'll still need to be satisfied that it's ready to go and to permit it. We don't really see any roadblocks, but they'll need to do their job.
Thank you, Frank.
Yep.
Second question I have is for Sharon. We often hear about regulation and management lagging behind actual water scarcity issues. Groundwater has been extensively regulated and accounted for within Arizona's active management area since 1980. Was this to get ahead of potential drought in the future or in response to drought conditions at the time, or do you know?
Well, that's a good question, and it brings up the important issue of drivers and do you foresee things and act, or do you wait for a crisis? in Arizona's case, back in 1980, what the key driver was that led to the Groundwater Management Act was that Arizona had planned for the Central Arizona Project, and funding, which came from the federal government, depended on Arizona showing that it was going to manage the groundwater resources it had more wisely than it had, so that this Colorado River water would be part of an overall good water management scheme, or system. And so it was in response to the need for the funding and the federal government saying, well, if you want that funding, please show us how you're going to manage the groundwater resources. But if you then take that as the driver and then look what occurred over the next 10 to 15 years, Arizona developed its statutory framework for storage and recovery, and that ended up being used to further policy objectives in ways that I don't think was anticipated. So in a sense, I think we did get ahead of the curve. And then in 1996, with the authorization of the Arizona Water Banking Authority, that was driven by a number of factors, including the fact that water we didn't use in Arizona would go to California, and we were concerned that we wouldn't get it back. And so a driver of that time was the availability of water and putting it to use, and one of the approved uses would be for storage for future beneficial use in the state of Arizona.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sharon. Jack, I have a question for you. So clearly ocean desal is not an option for Wyoming or other headwater states, but given that downstream states depend on return flows from water users, and you touched on this some in Wyoming, what can be done to make the water portfolio more robust, I guess, without harming downstream users? And feel free to address this from an ag perspective or from a broader perspective of all water users.
Well, I think bank storage is a true benefit to downstream users. The water is catching in the reservoir year-round. You know, it kind of gets delayed, and we use it, and then it comes back to the stream or to the aquifer, and it's going to be in the reservoir for the next use, whether it be irrigation or domestic use. Another thing about bank storage is there's no evaporation. I've seen how much the evaporation amounts to on reservoirs downstream from us, and evaporation has to be huge at reservoirs like Meade and Powell, you know, because of they're so large, and then because of the amount of heat that goes along with it. I think bank storage, you know, the water returns pretty much whole. You know, it either comes back to the stream or back to the aquifer. So I think it is a benefit to everyone down the stream.
Frank, if I can just follow up on, and you touched on evaporation off of, I'm sorry, Jack, you touched on evaporation from reservoirs. Just in the state of Wyoming, are water rights required to account for that consumptive use, that being the evaporation off of reservoirs?
Yeah, they have to account for that, you know, what disappears through that, and it's got to be credited to some account anyway.
Thanks, Jack. Frank, I'm going to ask another question of you. I could ask you questions all day on desal, but can you tell me if there's anything that's unique about Carlsbad's desal project as a new source of water? How is it incorporated into your existing distribution system? Do you think that the model is applicable in other coastal areas?
I would think it would be applicable to other coastal areas. It probably depends on the proximity of your existing system if you want to blend it. If you could pull up slide 14, I have kind of some backup slides. So this is a schematic that we put together. So you see the first click, we're pushed, so the desal plant's on the left side, obviously, where the ocean is. Again, we're building a 54-inch pipeline 10 miles to the east to bring it to, go ahead and next click, to our existing pipelines, where we'll connect it with pipeline 3 and pipeline 4. We're actually going to push the water north 5 miles to our Twin Oaks Valley Treatment Plant, which is a 100 million gallons a day plant. Blend it there, give it a booster shot of chlorine and other chemicals because the chlorine residual would have depleted by then, and then bring it back into pipeline 4, which is for distribution throughout the county. So it's important to note that I often get asked who's getting the water, and really the entire county is getting it because we're blending it with our other sources of treated water. No singular neighborhood or community is getting it exclusively. It'll be all blended.
Thank you, Frank. My next question is really for all of you. The drought monitor carries heavy political and regulatory implications. Do you feel like the drought monitor and other ways that drought is publicly portrayed or measured, is it portrayed or measured accurately to reflect drought in each of your locations?
Well, I'll go for us, for Southern California. Our drought has kind of took another step this week where Governor Brown brought down, essentially it was an edict on future policy is going to be, and the Department of Water Resources issued what are the new rules are going to be yesterday in draft form. So we're reacting to that now. I certainly don't think he overstepped. It is a serious issue here, and people are going to have to start cutting back. San Diego is a populated desert, and many of us have green lawns, and that may need to change if this is a sustained drought. What I tell people is that we don't know if this is the fourth year of a four-year drought or just the fourth year of what the future is going to be like.
So if I might jump in here, just that I don't actually show the drought monitor in my presentations that much because it changes quite a bit from time period to time period. And in Arizona, we're in a water scarce situation, and drought to me means you're in abnormally water scarce situation. And so sometimes the drought monitor may show that we don't have a lot of red or, it doesn't look that bad, but that could give people a false sense of security because we are in a long-term drought situation on the Colorado River. I mentioned earlier that Arizona's water supply is about 40% groundwater. Well, about 40% of its water supply comes from the Colorado River, some along the main stem and then some through the Central Arizona Project. So I think it's very good and it's useful to have, but I think to get the full picture, you need to explain a lot around it.
I feel the same way, that drought monitor kind of gives you a general idea, but you don't want to rely on it too specifically, or as it does change quite a bit, and you can't rely on it real closely.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue into the next question. Throughout the drought forum, we've heard some panelists express the idea that in the West, drought is the new normal. Do you, and this is for all of you, do you agree with this notion? And if so, on top of the things that you've already talked about, how do we need to adapt at the state and local level?
I think that's a pretty broad statement to say it's the new normal. I know we've been on a roller coaster here. Early 2000s were pretty droughty, and then 2011 was an unbelievably wet year. 2012, the following year, was just as dry as the year before it was wet. 13 wasn't good. Last year was a decent year. Now we're looking at a real dry year again. We have a 70% snowpack. So I don't know that it's really the new normal, but we've been more fortunate than like California and Nevada have been that we've had some intermittent wet years anyway and not continuous dry years.
Yeah, and I just add that, building on my prior response, that water scarcity has been and will be the norm in Arizona. And I think, in a sense, mathematically, it is true that if you have a long drought will be the new normal. And we experience that. One of the things I do besides serving as a professor at the University of Arizona is I serve on the board of directors of the Central Arizona Project. And we get monthly reports on the status of Lake Mead and snowmelt. And you get numbers like, well, this is 80% of normal or 100% snowmelt or snowpack of normal. Well, as you have less and less precipitation, those 30-year averages go down. And so in a sense, definitionally, drought becomes the new normal when you're comparing. So if you look at 120% of normal 10 years ago, that was a higher number than 120% of the current 30-year average. So I just want to point out that Again, it's the words you use or whatever, but what's really important is the actual water situation.
Yeah, I agree with that, with what she said. I mean, it's supposed to a degree it's a new normal until there's a newer normal. But like I said, we've been at it for 4 years now, so that does suggest that it's a pattern.
Thank you, all of you. That completes our moderated Q&A with the panelists, and now we're going to move into just open Q&A for all of those of you that are on the webinar and would like to send in some of your questions. We can start asking some of those. I have them in front of me. And one of the first questions I have is for Frank, and one of the questions that we're receiving from some of the attendees is in siting and designing the desalination plant, how was sea level rise taken into account?
I think it was considered in the environmental documents. Was it a driver for the project? No. Because we're relying on the lagoon and with the tidal flows and all that, I think we can sustain, a certain amount of seawater rise. Obviously the extent of that would be the question, but we can certainly accommodate some of that.
Secondly, and also it's back to you, Frank, to the San Diego Water Authority, well, I guess it's you, Frank, how do you plan to work with current and future statewide restriction declarations, such as the 25% order that California is currently under?
Well, we're reacting to that now. Again, that came out from Governor Brown just recently. So we're reacting to that. Again, that's on a agency-by-agency basis. And the way the Water Authority is a water wholesaler, we sell water to 25 member agencies. And so those member agencies will be dealing with it. We'll be assisting them. It won't be a one-size-fits-all, because in San Diego County we have some agencies that are 90% agricultural, and then we have some that are 100% urban. So it won't be a one-size-fits-all. We also, we're assuming that they're going to take into account local water development for those agencies that have done it, like San Diego. So I think that's going to be worked out over the next couple of weeks.
Thanks. Of the $2,000 per acre foot figure that you put up, Frank, for desal, do you have an idea of how much of that cost is associated with power for the desal plant?
By percentage, no, I don't. The facility uses 37 megawatts, so it's a big user. Primarily because you have the membranes, and then again we're pushing the water 15 miles away, 1,100 feet up vertically. So it is a big energy user. I would say, in terms of operating costs, probably a quarter to third, but that's a guesstimate on my part.
So clearly, if those power costs could be reduced, that's going to be a feather in the cap for desal.
Yes. Okay. And we do have there's a firm in Northern California that developed energy reduction units where that energy that isn't used, instead of bleeding it off, you can bring it back to the front of the system and reuse it. So that actually reduced the amount of energy we're using by just about half.
Great, thank you. Jack, you talked much about flood irrigation, and I heard every word you said about it. It may not work everywhere. What we're seeing in Nevada, as we're seeing all across the West, is that farmers are going to more efficient ways of irrigating through pivots and low-hanging nozzles, et cetera. And we had discussion at the Drought Forum that that's fine. That's fine. You're using less water. But the next question is, what are you doing with that saved water, that conserved water? Are you putting in more pivots? Are you putting in more irrigation? Or is the system getting the benefit of that conservation? So in Nevada, if someone is trying to reduce their consumptive use, that's a good thing. But more importantly, what are you doing with that conserved water? So I guess the shorter question is, if you had a lot of farmers in your area go to more efficient ways of irrigation and not putting in more crops, couldn't the system see the same benefit as what you're getting out of the flood irrigation?
Well, a lot of times we have more acres than we can get across with flood irrigation, so someone may put in a sprinkler to be more efficient on part of it, but then they still need that water to try and cover the other acres that are still unwatered. I don't think anybody's putting in more crops, and we're under an acreage cap on the North Platte River here as far as the number of acres that can be irrigated in our agreement on the river. So there isn't a lot of opportunity here. There isn't much opportunity for storage or for irrigating any more acres. So, at times I think there's they're trying to send more water down the stream. I know, who is it, NRCS tried to write a deal into the Farm Bill that, any saved water, they called it, from more efficient irrigation had to stay in the stream. Well, a lot of times there's still more commitments for that water. It's not new commitments, but it's, an older water right that just hasn't been able to be used as wholly as they would like to, that they can cover more ground, but it's not new ground.
Thanks, Jack. Sharon, has the aquifers, the groundwater basins in Arizona, have they looked at basically being drought resistant?
In a way, yes, but not always. I mean, groundwater levels have declined over periods of times, due both to reduced recharge. I mean, there is mountain front recharge, and there is recharge that occurs near the streams from snowmelt. I'll talk to the Tucson area in particular. So you do get some recharge, and when you do have drought conditions that are local drought conditions, you don't get that recharge. And you also may have more utilization occurring. And in the Tucson area in particular, a lot of our use of Colorado River water is, in fact, through storage and recovery. It's not through delivery to a treatment plant, such as occurs in Las Vegas or in many areas in the Phoenix region. So users are taking and putting the water underground. And in the case of Tucson Water in particular, their recovery wells are right in the area of hydrologic impact of that storage. And so, in a way, Tucson has, and I point this out often, a very drought-resilient delivery system because it's depending on pumped water now, and if there were some curtailment, if there were a shortage and it were deep enough, and there's so many ifs to it that I don't have time to get into all the conditions that would occur before Tucson Water would have to call on some of its own stored water. It's got the pumps to do it. It's got the recovery wells to do it. So you could say it's drought resistant, but there is an amount of storage there in the aquifers that's fossil water, and it would take a very, very long time to replenish that if that were used in times of a very severe drought. So our aquifers are both serve as storage reservoirs. They're also insurance for us in times of drought.
Thank you, Sharon. A question we have for you, Jack. How are the Wyoming conservation districts working with ag producers in the state to improve resilience to drought?
Well, there is more sprinkler irrigation happening, not necessarily in our area, because we get one cutting the grass, and it's pretty hard to justify a sprinkler system on that. And then some of these other places, they're pretty limited on. I don't know much about sprinklers, but I guess if you start them up too early and then you get a freeze, it'll collapse the whole system and stuff like that. So those are some challenges in this country to go into a sprinkler or drip or something like that. Is some gated pipe. I know there's quite a few people have used that. The ditch loss I talked about and stuff. If you put it in a gated pipe, at least you're going to get it all to the lands where it's supposed to go, and maybe a cheaper way of doing that. But there's, like I say, we're kind of limited because of our elevation and our type of crops and stuff of what we can afford to do. But the conservation districts work with the NRCS and try and do projects, irrigation projects that help people out and make them more efficient.
Thanks, Jack. Frank, I have a question for you. There are concerns regarding ocean desal and its economic and environmental impacts, including effects to marine systems. Can you speak to that?
Well, that obviously was an issue that we dealt with during the development of the project. Our desal plant, again, we're taking advantage of an existing intake facility that was bringing cooling water into the adjacent power plant. So, to our mind, and we kind of show that in the documents, that in terms of marine life, kill, or whatever, however you want to characterize it, that was an increase. Now, we are going to have to modify that intake in a couple of years because that power plant is going to be decommissioned, and we're working on that now. That'll be a new permitting exercise, but we've come up with the designs that we've looked at it with different fish species, and we think we can satisfy everyone that we're not increasing that mortality rate. So that's how we're addressing it. But again, we have the advantage of the existing intake in that lagoon that showed up on the first picture.
Thanks, Frank. Appreciate that. Back to Sharon, and if you already discussed this, I apologize. We were talking about storage, ASRs and things in Arizona as is happening across the West. Is there much storage occurring with treated effluent?
Yes, there is storage that's occurring with treated effluent. That's allowed for in our permitting system within Arizona. You do have to get an aquifer protection permit from our Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, which is an additional permit when compared to storing Colorado River water in aquifers. But yes, it comes under the basically the same rules and regulations. Of course, any issues related to water quality have to be addressed. So some of the storage that's occurred, in fact, most of it in Arizona has been for use for outdoor irrigation. We do not yet have much in the way of indirect potable reuse, such as you have in Orange County, California. But there is a good deal of storage going on in basins, some of it actually in river streams where effluent is being discharged pursuant to permits from wastewater treatment plants. But the water quality issues are different, and so questions come up. Some have even been talking about possibly using sites for both Central Arizona Project water recharge as well as effluent. But yes, it's used a lot, and there's a new facility in the west part of the Phoenix Valley where the recharge credits are being used from effluent to meet some of the replenishment obligation of our Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District. So a long way of saying yes.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Jack, you mentioned intermittent dry and wet years over the last 10 years or so. How do the extremely dry years affect ag production in that area, in your area? What are the economic impacts on your local level?
It's a pretty severe impact on us. It's, we're just in a 8-9 inch rainfall area, and we're close to the mountains, so we always get some runoff, but 12 was an extremely bad year, and if we don't get any rain on our pasture lands on the sagebrush country and stuff, we have very little feed there, and we don't get much for our hay meadows. If you can't get them pretty wet, they aren't going to grow very much. And so I know we bought an awful lot of hay in 12 and 13 and tried to hold the cow herd together and stuff, but it was a pretty severe impact on us.
Thanks, Jack. And probably our last question of the day, too. Frank, we saw a photo of the footprint of the desal plant. Can you give me a feel for how large that is in terms of acres?
I think it's about, I want to say it's just over 10. It's a very constrained site. It's been our biggest issue for construction is there's really no lay-down space. That's my feel for it. Actually, I've never seen that number used anywhere in terms of exactly how many acres it is.
But it's not something that's just, I mean, I was thinking something much larger than that. 10 acres isn't a whole lot.
Right. It's very, like I said, it's a very tight site. I may be understating that, but I think I'm pretty close.
Bear with me.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the public-private financing approach being used in the desal plant? I don't think that has been traditionally been used on water infrastructure in the U.S. to the extent that they've been used in transportation. Has San Diego confronted any public opposition to using this approach?
No. Again, the public financing components of that are, the Water Authority has a pretty high credit rating, so that was one reason why they came to us. It made it cheaper. But again, in terms of paying off the debt, the way the WPA, Water Purchase Agreement, is constructed, Poseidon is responsible for paying off the debt. The Water Authority's responsibility is to pay for the water. And so, obviously the proceeds from us paying Poseidon is what Poseidon will use to pay off that debt. But if for some reason the plant can't produce or some other thing that would happen where Poseidon isn't accumulating the revenue they need, that risk is borne by them. So it's a revenue-based partnership.
Thanks, Sharon. Have you had much experience with any of that in Arizona, or do you have an opinion on that?
I have an opinion that's not necessarily related to too much experience in Arizona. I agree with the premise that in the water area, it's newer. It's going to be used more. I'm very familiar with the way desalination has been funded in Israel, and the plant operator, if I understand correctly, Frank, is IDE Technologies USA, right, which is the same company that has entered into agreements with the government in Israel. I think that for sure, and we all recognize it, that water is going to become more expensive. We're going to need more infrastructure, whether it's for desalination plants, for storage facilities, transmission facilities, and I do believe that we're going to see more and more innovative approaches to public-private partnerships. So I think that we all should be paying close attention to these types of arrangements.
Thank you. And we're going to bring this webinar to closure here. I really want to thank the panelists today, Frank Belock, Jack Berger, and Sharon Megdal, for participating, in the spirit of what this webinar was titled, One Size Doesn't Fit All, Why There Are So Many Differences Across the West. We talked about desal. We talked about irrigation practices and what's good and what doesn't work necessarily. We talked about storage of water rights and the things that's going on in Arizona, and it's easy to see how it truly is. One size does not fit all. Drastically different than what some of the things we're encountering here in Nevada. And again, just want to thank everybody for participating. Pray for rain. We got some snow here in Carson City last night, just a dusting, but hopefully we can get some more precip. And I'd now like to turn it back over to, I think, Carly. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Jason. And thank you, Jason, for moderating today's panel discussion. Thank you all panelists for speaking. And thank you to everyone who's joined to listen to this final webinar in the Western Governors Drought Forum webinar series. I just wanted to briefly say that we will send a wrap-up email on Friday with a link to the webinar recording that will be posted on YouTube and a brief summary of the key discussion points brought up today. You can also check out westgov.org for our online resource library, which features case studies and best practices for drought management. If you take a look at that resource and if there's something that you know that is missing, please email me at cbrown@westgov.org and we will get it included. Again, thank you all for your participation in the Western Governors Drought Forum.